Thanks you all for coming out. I know it's almost happy hour, so I really appreciate you guys being here. There's really a lot of great talks at Spark Summit about really deep machine learning, performance improvements, and extending the Spark framework to do really cool things, but this is not a talk about that. One of those things that all of those sort of assume is high quality, really good data. You can't do good machine learning without good, clean data. But that's not really an assumption you can always make. So this talk is about what to do when you can't make that assumption. I'm going to start by framing the problem, what we do at Radius, particularly on the data engineering team. What is human validation, how we use it, what are the costs, the benefits, and challenges to it. Sort of the talk then about the experimental nature of human validation processes, and how we devise appropriate sampling methodology when multiple teams with different intentions are going to try and use the same resulting data. I'll finish up with the flow of data through our pipeline, how we've improved it using human validation, and talk about the power of positive feedback cycles. So first, the core product of Radius is a predictive marketing B2B software platform. It lets our customers identify and target the best prospects and the best segments of prospects across the entire US market. So most predictive marketing companies occupy one or the other of these two data spaces. On the proprietary data side are big data providers, and they typically will give you a huge database of data and let you figure out what to do with it. So you may have to build your own data science team, but ultimately you're going to be limited by the fields and the values provided by that data set. On the other side, there's the customer data, which typically is occupied by what we might call traditional predictive companies. Now, it's a pretty young space, so traditional is not really necessarily applicable, but in general, they have to rely on the data provided by their customers. Now, that data is input generally by sales and marketing teams who aren't really known for the quality of their data input. So first of all, you're going to be limited by the schemas and by the quality that that customer has provided the data to you. But you're also going to have to do a lot of custom work for each particular customer just to make sure that your models can even be predictively powerful. Now, Radius bridges the gap here to provide the best of both worlds with minimal custom effort. We build our own proprietary business graph, which can be used to build features for the predictive model. And we use our customers' data, but just to provide labels. So the fields that we can use for this involving, say, a win or a loss of an opportunity are the ones that usually are the highest fidelity coming from our customers because they actually rely on those fields for what they're doing. We match our customers' data to our proprietary business graph on shared fields, and then we can build really powerful predictive models to target better customers for them. So I'll zoom in a little bit on the data engineering at Radius. Our ultimate responsibility is to build and deliver this Radius business graph up to date every 2 weeks or so. So it's a really large, complex batch job. Fortunately, we have Spark. So we use Spark every step of the process. We use GraphX and MLlib where necessary. We use Databricks as well for prototyping and exploration and rapid queries, as well as some production jobs. This combination of tools lets us be flexible and fast in experimentation and exploration, but also robust and reliable in production, so we can get that graph out on a 2-week schedule without a lot of hiccups. Roughly, the pipeline goes like this. We first collect the data from many different sources on daily, weekly, and monthly intervals. We standardize, normalize, and understand our data better so we can compare apples to apples. We then match, group, combine all the records from different sources that point to the same business, and then resolve those groups of records into a set of attributes and fields for each business, and then combine those records into a giant graph of all the businesses in the US. Pretty straightforward. Meanwhile, we have a team that monitors, analyzes, and reports on all of these processes that all the other teams do, which lets us make sure that everything is running smoothly and constantly improve. So why do we need to use human validation? Well, business information is a really difficult problem. So for one, businesses are constantly opening, closing, moving, changing their attributes. This is a manageable problem at the level of a city block, but when you have to model the entire US economy, it's a major issue. Additionally, business data comes in many different shapes and sizes, and it's difficult to model, say, a mom-and-pop retail bakery with the same attributes in the same fields as a global shipping company. Our sources have a lot of challenges as well, but they also have different methods, different strengths and weaknesses, and it's not always very clear to us exactly what those are. In any case, none of our sources are reliable enough to be consistently considered ground truth. So we have to consider all of their data points to be proposals or opinions. And by independently validating these sources in a scientific and experimental manner, we can actually better understand those sources and use the knowledge to build a model stronger than the sum of the parts. Of course, from the perspective of our customers, our business graph is also a proposal or an opinion. So we use the same validation processes to validate our own output and make sure that what we're delivering is of consistently high quality. So, human validation comes in a lot of shapes and sizes as well. We can typically bin all the different kinds of validation tasks into these three major groups, which are increasing both in cost and complexity, but also in potential value. The simplest is prompted validation. A little more complex than that is research validation. And finally, the most complex and most valuable is research curation. And I'll go into each one of these in a little more detail. So prompted validation is a fairly straightforward process. We give all the information necessary to a validator in a guided flowchart form, effectively. Every possible outcome at every step has a clear label, which is easy for them to assign and easy for us to parse later on. In this example, we want to determine if the phone number and the address are correct for a given business. So first, the validator will call the phone number, decide whether it connects or not, label that. If it does connect, then they look at the business name. Well, is this the right business? If so, great. How about this address? Is this the right address? And of course, they'll be talking to a real person in the ideal scenario. Now, not every action here has a clear answer. For instance, if they reach a voicemail and it's the default voicemail from the phone company, so they can't really say for sure whether or not it's the right business, we offer a U for unsure option that lets them off the hook a little bit. Now, down the road, if we have these U unsure data points, we'll typically throw those out, whether we're doing analysis or machine learning, but they are pretty useful to determine confidence of our validators. If one is consistently delivering U's, maybe they're not really trying hard enough. If one is never putting a U, perhaps they're a little overconfident. The second degree of validation would be called research validation. It's still, fortunately for us, results in simple Boolean or categorical labels, but the questions necessarily require some freedom to search for the answers. In this example, we want to know, is this business location part of a chain or a large company that has a lot of locations? The validator can use the company website, they can use Google, any information they can find online to answer this question, and they're free to do that. However, this is actually kind of a complex question that you might not realize at first glance. For instance, what about an independently owned Chevrolet dealership? Well, is that part of a chain? I don't know, is it? What about a doctor who's part of a provider network? There's a lot of edge cases and complexities, so we have to be really clear and precise when we're training and prompting the human validators to make sure that we get the results that we're looking for. Finally, research curation is the most difficult both for validators to find the answers to and for us to actually parse back in. Now that's because it's an open-ended question. So the good news is that it doesn't require a proposed answer, which means we're actually able to fill out data points that we don't have an answer for. In this example, we're looking for the headquarters of a company. And this information should exist online somewhere, most likely, and they should be able to find it with some effort. Perhaps the greater challenge here is actually ingesting the results when they come back in, because they're going to be unstructured text. Now, additionally, it's often good to know the source of the information. If they're out there on the internet researching and finding data points, we want to know where those data points are coming from. Not necessarily so that we can double check every answer, but we could be able to find trends, common sources, and that might lead us to actually ingest new sources at a larger scale and improve the quality of the graph more substantially. So those are sort of the types of validation. Well, what are the benefits? This is pretty straightforward. It's labeled reasonable ground truth data. It's a huge benefit, and we can use it for a lot of different things. So supervised machine learning requires ground truth. We get that with human validation. Internal metrics of the quality, accuracy of the business graph, also useful to have if we have some validation. Competitive analysis, how good are we doing against those other data providing companies? Well, if we have human validation, we can figure this out. If there's any concerns about human validation, and there should be, they can be somewhat assuaged by the fact that our customers are also humans. So it makes sense to use humans to validate the data that other humans are going to consume. If you'll indulge me for a little bit, I'm going to use Dark Side of the Moon as a reference for the cost of human validation. It syncs up not unlike the Wizard of Oz. So money, time, and us and them, or communication. The first and obvious, most literal cost is money. Now, human validation costs more per data point than the aggregated information, like what we get from our sources. On the other hand, the hourly rate of a human validator is a lot lower than the hourly rate of a data scientist. So it does make sense to use them when possible. We strive to balance, however, that we have enough validation to really get a good confidence interval on the metrics we want to determine, and have enough training data for our machine learning models, but not so much that we're kind of throwing money down a hole to get data labeled that we're not actually going to be able to use for anything. And this balance is actually a core differentiator between what Radius does and what some of the other data providing companies do, which is to say they have a massive human validation team, as you can see on the right side of this slide, huge call centers, huge research centers, and huge budgets. And they actually validate every data point on some time recurring cycle. But we're able to match them on the accuracy and the breadth of our data model with a small validation team and a small team of really good data scientists and engineers. That seems like a better bet to me. The second cost, of course, is time. It is not instantaneous to validate data with humans. Certainly not as fast as, say, Spark. And if we take too long to get those results back, then we might not be able to have an impact on the next build. So to mitigate that cost, we built a PySpark framework that actually allows us to automatically sample data, process it into experiments that make sure that our validators see what they need to see and nothing more, but that we retain the other information we need behind the scenes so that when the results come back, we can automatically join it back together and run the analyses that we need. So the only bottleneck now is actually the validation time, which is great for us. Now we can speed that up even more by parallelizing human validation between a lot of different teams and different validators. There's a hidden cost here, which is that different teams and different individuals may differ in their interpretation and their execution of the experiments, so we need to be mindful of those differences, particularly if we're aggregating metrics all back together at the end. The silver lining of that is that we actually can compare our teams and compare our validators to see which ones are performing better or worse, which are more accurate, and which have some issues to work out. If any of the teams are significant outliers, we can actually address that issue before we introduce the results back into the system and create bias. Another concern of time is that the underlying ground truth may actually change or decay after it's been validated. Like I said, businesses are always constantly changing, moving, closing, opening, and so the same phone number might actually point to a different business from one year to the next to the next. If we are using old trained validated data to build a model, then it might actually not be particularly great for the present scenario. Finally, communication is a major cost here. We have extensive domain knowledge, a really clear idea about the purposes of our experiments, but translating that into simple tasks and communicating those expectations can actually be surprisingly difficult, as we saw in the example of the chain problem. This communication gap can lead to false assumptions, misinterpretations, and which themselves can lead to false conclusions in analysis or a production model trained with improper labels. Because these data points have really high leverage in our business graph, it's important and crucial to ensure that we're aligned with our validation teams and that the results we get back are those that we expect going in. One of the ways we can mitigate this concern is by sending out a small sample of the experiment up front. If we can inspect the results quickly and say, yes, this looks good, this is what we expect, let's send out the full experiment, or no, actually there's some misconceptions here, let's resolve those and then move on to the next one. So validated data is to our data scientists like bison was to Native Americans on the plains. Every one is extremely valuable, and we want to make sure to get as much value and as much use out of it as possible. The subject of the talk, of course, is using validated data for KPI analysis and machine learning training sets, so those are the main two uses that we have. KPI, of course, stands for Key Performance Indicator, for those of you not on the business jargon. It's a metric used to measure how well a team or an organization is doing at their core responsibilities. Our KPIs typically involve the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of our business graph. For example, how accurate are the phone numbers we propose for each business? This would be a really impossible task if we didn't have some kind of human validation. Similarly, we need to have labeled training data to build machine learning algorithms, supervised learning models, and even to train simple heuristics on which source to prefer in a dispute over a certain value. One additional use that is here in orange, because it's a little bit riskier, is spot hypothesis validation. So suppose one of our data scientists has a hypothesis that data points from a certain cohort or a certain source are more or less accurate than those from another. Well, she can actually pull validated data from the vault of data we collect and actually compare those two cohorts directly. Now, this is risky because if the original samples were intended for a different purpose, there might be some biases in those sets that need to be aware of that, so that you don't draw a false conclusion from data that wasn't really intended for that purpose. But it can be pretty useful just to sort of quickly check a hypothesis before committing to a full experiment. Now, ultimately, because validation is expensive, it's time-consuming, we want to make sure to minimize the number of validations that we need to still meet all of our needs. Which leads us to the idea of multiple consumer sampling, which I think is an unnecessarily complicated phrase, so I apologize for that. Basically, we want to make sure that our validated data can be used by as many downstream users as possible, and that we can minimize the total sample that we need to validate. In the best case scenario, the effective populations for the downstream uses are identical. In this example, the chain problem, standalone versus chain again, each business location has exactly one value for this field. Either it is a standalone or it is a chain. Therefore, the populations for our KPI analysis and for our machine learning algorithm are identical. So great, there's one value per location. We'll just take a random sample. Now, of course, we should note here that accuracy is not a very good metric if the classes are unbalanced. And indeed, that is the case here. There's many more standalones than there are chains in the US. So a strong analysis will consider that and use appropriate confusion metrics to determine how accurate you really are, depending on the business case. And a strong machine learning model will actually weight the points from each class according to the business use case. If you really want to be strictly excluding chains, then we should make sure that that is the metric we are prioritizing. Sometimes, however, it is not so easy. So in this case, the phone accuracy, or I guess phone precision is a more appropriate title, it's one of our major KPIs. We have a supervised classification model that scores all the phone numbers that we have in our graph. So you'll see here on this slide that each vertical blue line represents a single business location. Each dot on that, whether red or blue, represents a single phone number in that business location that's proposed by one or another source. The horizontal line is a threshold of our phone model. So all the numbers scoring below that line in red will be thrown out before anybody sees them downstream. And all the numbers in blue might be proposed as a number for that place as well. However, if there are multiple blue numbers, only the highest scoring number, which we here flag with an X, is actually sent to the customers and assigned to that location. So our training set population here is actually all of the phone numbers, all the reds, all the blues, everything. But the KPI population, our phone precision calculations, depend only on the numbers that are flagged with an X, which is a subset of the training set population. So our sampling methodology is to sample from all the phones and then make sure to clearly label the difference between an X number and a non-X number so that when we need to run the KPI analysis, we are clear on that. Finally, I'm going to tie it all together and talk about sort of a basic production pipeline, how it does a pretty good job, but with this human validation in place, we can actually do a lot better. So this is a very simplified version of our production flow in data engineering. The raw data, which actually I think is a lot more than 1 billion records, comes into our pipeline. We aggregate it, we process it, we group it, we make a lot of decisions about resolving fields and attributes within each place. We create a business graph on all of that, and then we deliver that to our customers via our app. The pipeline, fortunately, is optimized and efficient thanks to Spark and our data engineers, but it's certainly limited by the input data and by the quality of our decisions and our models. So how do we improve it consistently? With human validation and a positive feedback cycle. So here we can sample and validate the graph every time we build a new version. Along the left branch of the cycle, we can take the sampled and validated data, convert that into labeled training data, which we can then retrain our models, reconsider and update our heuristics, and implement those back into our production code. The next build, therefore, should contain even more accurate data because we're making better choices while we're preparing it. On the right branch, we take the same sampled human validated data, analyze the results of those experiments, and we can determine how good our graph is right now. Our PMs, our executives can track the progress and allocate resources appropriately, and our engineers and our scientists can focus on what matters most for the entire business graph and for the business at large. Our PMs are satisfied, our executives are satisfied, our customers are satisfied, everyone's happy. Ultimately, this positive feedback cycle results in consistent improvement over time, even if the data quality from our sources changes without us knowing about it, because we're constantly iterating and improving. And of course, this lets us be better than the sum of our parts. That's it for the talk. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I'll take them now.
Any questions? So in terms of the application to send these tasks to the humans,
right.
You can either build a custom one, or there are vendors like Crowdflower, or there's open source ones like Pybosa. So which ones did you guys end up using and why?
We have built a custom one. It's more effective and kind of more reliable to develop existing relationships with the same validation teams rather than outsource to a third party that will kind of route them their own way. And we've built our own UI for actually facilitating those validations as well.
And to get higher quality than a single human, one answer might be multiple humans and quorum. So is that something that you guys do as well, where you send the same question to multiple human validators and then arrive at a quorum-based response?
Yeah, that's kind of an allocation of resources question. Certainly, we have limited resources so that if we were to double or triple validate the same data, then it's going to cost us 2 or 3 times as much. So kind of a more small-scale usage of that is actually to send the same question to multiple different validators, but not to get a quora on what the correct answer is, so much as to determine how accurate those validators are. If we have sort of a known truth set and can send those questions out to, let's say, a new validator to actually kind of test them on how good they are at the task, then we can trust them to deliver an answer downstream.
Yeah, one question. For the size of the data that you were describing, Could you give us an idea of the size of the workforce of validators that you have?
I'm not sure exactly how many validators we have. I would estimate it's on the scale of dozens, probably not more than 100. But certainly the actual quantity of validation is limited more by what confidence intervals we demand for the accuracy metrics and how much training data we need for machine learning models, and it's not more than that. So I think the large data providers have thousands of people in their call centers, and we have orders of magnitude fewer than that.
One follow-up question. Considering that many of these machine learning algorithms are usually very resilient, even with data of varying quality, let's say, do you have some metrics in terms of data quality? I mean, what level of data quality you consider for your training data sets in order to deliver good quality results?
So the question is, how accurate do the validators need to be really be considered ground truth?
In a way.
It's kind of an uphill battle, certainly. So ideally, probably better than 95%, but considering that it's almost certainly better than the combination of our sources without any machine learning applied, I think that we can trust it and expect it to be better than what we get otherwise, and just strive to constantly improve.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dan.